Hello and welcome to ADEC's In Conversation special series addressing COVID-19. I'm your series moderator, Dr. Jill Harrington, coming to you from our nation's capital, the Washington, D.C. area. Also with me today here is Mr. Isaiah Allen, Executive Director of ADEC, coming to us from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today we welcome ADEC members who are going to be talking about a very important topic here today, grief and resilience, coping with uncertainty, and the power of positive thinking. So joining me here today are Dr. Heidi Horsley. Dr. Horsley is a licensed psychologist and social worker who maintains a private practice in New York City. She's also the co-founder and executive director of the Open to Hope Foundation, as well as an adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of Social Work. Dr. Horsley is coming to us from Arizona here today. Also with us here today is Dr. Gloria Horsley. Dr. Horsley is a family therapist, as well as the co-founder of the Open to Hope Foundation. She's a past faculty member at the University of Rochester. She's also a frequent speaker on television and TV and talk shows addressing issues primarily in grief, loss, and hope. She's coming to us today here from Palo Alto, California. Dr. Peggy Whiting, who's a fellow in thanatology. She's also been a grief counselor in private practice for many years. She's a professor and co-coordinator of counselor education at North Carolina Central University, as well as a licensed clinical mental health counselor supervisor. She also serves with me on the ADEC conference committee and is our incoming vice president. We also like to welcome Mr. Robert Zucker, who's a fellow in thanatology and licensed clinical social worker. Mr. Zucker is also the author of The Journey Through Grief and Loss. Now, Rob, I didn't ask you where you're coming to us from today.
I'm in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is in the western part of the state.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, welcome. And then finally we have Mr. Jacob van Wielink coming to us from the Netherlands. He is a grief counselor and executive coach. He's also a partner at De School voor Transitie in the Netherlands and a faculty member at the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. He's also the author of Loss, Grief, and Attachment in Life Transitions, A Clinician's Guide to Secure-Based Counseling, published by Routledge. And I want to thank you all here today to talk about this really important topic, the power, dealing with uncertainty and the power of positive thinking. I just wanted to kind of right now talk a little bit about, positive psychology was started in 1988 when Martin Seligman kind of named it as a theme for the American Psychological Association. This whole idea that it was sort of in response against psychoanalysis and behaviorism, which really focused on mental illness and maladaptive behaviors and negative thinking. And so the idea of positive psychology really built on a humanistic movement, which encouraged an emphasis on happiness and well-being and creating a foundation of fostering hope through positive well-being, through works, through clubs, through physical exercise, mindfulness, meditation, things that can kind of bring us happiness. I know that being trained in cognitive behavioral psychology, that what cognitive behavioral therapists often learn, the cognitive model, is that our thinking precedes our mood, which influences our behavior. So how we perceive life situations, and that's just sort of the 101 on cognitive psychology, how we perceive life situations and think about them can really influence our mood, which influences our behavior. And certainly not to subscribe to a Pollyanna type of thinking. Judy Beck often talks about being able to be realistically positive with oneself and others. And we often see this through a lot of profound loss, through crisis, through many traumas. I mean, our lessons learned from Viktor Frankl and his personal experiences in a Nazi concentration camp. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And one of the quotes I've always had above my desk is, "The last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances." And we even know this when people are facing the ultimate of life's circumstances, and that could be dying. Invoking the power of hopefulness in some way, hopefulness that maybe you may not be suffering anymore, hopefulness that your family may be able to carry on when you're not here. And we do that as grief therapists and counselors, is try to provide hope through profound loss. I know peers provide an immense amount of hope to others that they can live through their loss of their loved ones. So one of my favorite, I'm a big superhero fan, and one of my favorite scenes recently was in Avengers Endgame, Even for the Dying, when Pepper Potts was there at the end with Tony Stark and he was dying. and she gave him permission to die, and the hope that she and her daughter would be okay in life. That gave him comfort in the end. So even through some of the most distressing of life circumstances, we can provide hope through a lot of uncertainty. So with that said, I kind of wanted to ask all of you how you're dealing with this uncertainty, and how are you trying to invoke positive thinking and maybe a sense of hope? Anyone?
Well, oh, Heidi,
Go,
go
Mom.
for it.
Go for it, Mom.
You didn't say we're mother-daughter, Jill.
All right, so I have the dynamic duo here today, and that they are Cape Crusaders in my eyes. We have Gloria and Heidi Horsley from the Open to Hope Foundation, mother and daughter, who are really champions of providing hope to those going through profound loss. So I think, Heidi, you wanted to start?
Oh, okay. Usually I defer to my mother, but I'll start if my mom doesn't mind.
Gloria then. Gloria, would you start?
Oh, no, let Heidi go. She's on the front lines for the COVID.
Yeah, I wanted to start because I on March 22nd, I tested positive for COVID-19 and I had symptoms. What happened was March 14th, I was living in New York City, which is where I live, decided to go out of town for vacation. And just because it was getting very stressful to live there, and I live on the 44th floor in Midtown, it was getting harder to socially distance. So I flew to Arizona, and on the 17th, I started getting symptoms, and they were very classic symptoms. By the 22nd, I had a fever and went to a COVID-19 testing site and got tested, and 2 days later found out I was COVID positive. So I've had to practice a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy and positive coping skills on myself. It's really put me to the test. And one of the things I've learned about being COVID positive, and my symptoms are finally gone, except for the lack of taste and smell. But one of the things I've learned is there's a lot of shame and guilt around testing positive for COVID-19. And a lot of people are not talking about it yet, but I think it will come out more and more, because the thing about COVID-19 is you are positive before you know it. And so you are exposing people before you know it. And I was on an airplane in a middle seat before I knew I had COVID-19. So you just wonder who you may have infected, and then you worry about your family being infected. So that being said, I know we're into the positive psychology here and not the negative stuff. I was in my room. I had to be, when they called me and told me I was COVID positive, they told me I had to isolate in my room alone for 2 weeks. And it was a very strange thing because my family was on the other side of the bedroom door. And I had to think about what am I going to do to feel good? And what am I going to do to stay in a positive place, which is normally how I am. And I had to give myself permission, and I know Rob and I have talked a little bit about this, to validate and acknowledge the fact that we're in a very stressful situation right now. And that it's okay to be stressed and anxious and not minimize what's going on. And after that, I had to say, okay, now what am I going to do, given that I feel this way? And you can do things every day for yourself. And I know this panel will have a lot of ideas. I mean, I decided I was going to walk a few days after I started feeling a little bit better. And I was sick, but I wasn't as sick as a lot of people. I decided I was going to walk 10,000 steps in my bedroom every day. I put a Fitbit on. My bedroom is very small, and I did 10,000 steps. It sounds very strange and little, but I needed goals. Even if they were small, I connected with people on the internet. I did 10,000 steps, and I made my bed. So we can pass it on to other people, but those are little things that I did to kind of start shifting my energy initially.
But I think, Heidi, you bring up such an important point. You know, it's easy to be positive when everything is going on in your life. When things are happy, they're good, your health is intact. You know, we really work with people to try to get a sense of realistic positivity, or try to lean on that when things are really dire.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I wanted to make a comment before Heidi passes on this, because I, as a parent, had to hear that my daughter, I live in California, she's in Arizona, that she is COVID positive. I see all this stuff on TV with the respirators, everybody dying. Will there be enough respirators? I have had a son die, and which is the reason we started our foundation, Open to Hope, a 17-year-old son. So to have another child on the, be fearful that they also might die, I really had to call on my power of positive thinking, realizing that years ago I gave up control of the idea that I could be in charge of the world, and that what would happen, and giving up that idea that I could do that. So I think that's some of the power of positive thinking that you learn through resilience and having a terrible event happen to you many years earlier.
Hmm. So difficult. How were you able to maintain a sense of sort of hope through all that uncertainty?
Well, as I said, I've already been through the death of a child. I know I can survive it. I've been through the worst. I've done it. I've survived it. I'm not even going to go there. I think the way that I dealt with the power of positive thinking was saying, okay, it can happen, but I'm going to put other thoughts in my mind, other pictures. And Heidi and I work together and do broadcasting to help people stay open to hope. We do podcasts. And I will tell you one of the things that has happened. And by the way, Joe, you were saying we give people hope. We don't give them hope. We open them to the idea that there could be hope, that they could find their own hope, that they could look into their resilience, that they can drop into it and find it. We don't give those people hope. So that's why we called our foundation Open to Hope. But I just wanted to say that in February, let's see, Heidi, in March, we had 330,000 people download our podcast. In April. The month before, in March, we only had 70,000 people. So people are looking for hope. They're looking for how we can do it. And people from ADAC a lot came on to give us those hopeful, positive thinking ideas, resilience, all those kinds of things. So it's pretty amazing what can happen with the internet and what you're doing.
No, Gloria, you're absolutely right. I mean, I know you don't give people hope, but you definitely open up that aperture of hope for people. But I would argue that you give a lot of people hope just by what you do. So, and the fact that you're here today talking about this extraordinarily stressful time, and the fact that you've been able to really maintain a sense of pulling on some of that positive thinking. What do you think some of the roadblocks, Heidi and Gloria, what do you think some of the roadblocks of positive thinking are during this pandemic? Or
I think for me, the roadblocks is that we are our own worst enemies. So in my case, I got into my head and thought, oh my gosh, how bad is this going to get? Like I became a psychic. You know, am I going to end up not being able to breathe? Am I going to end up in a respirator? Am I going to end up in a hospital? Am I going to end up dying? Because I needed to take a news break sometimes, and I needed to get out of my own head and do thought stopping, you know, and say, stop, think about something else. Statistically speaking, the odds are low that you're going to end up in a hospital, you know? So that was one thing that I really had to practice on myself, not allowing myself to go down worst case scenario.
And Heidi's attitude certainly penetrated our attitude, because she, I think, maybe even tried to keep my husband and I's spirits up when we talked to her. So that penetrated our attitude. But I think the news has really been very, very difficult. That's a scary thing for me to see, you know, all these bodies and trying to get the respirators, and will we have enough respirators, and, you know, on and on, looking at the negative. I was frankly happy to see the President of the United States yesterday gathering a group of people together who've survived the COVID, because it, you know, to see all this news, to see, one thing I don't like is to act like people treat bodies differently. In my background, I'm a nurse. When people die, those people aren't callous. They showed pictures of people being taken out, dead bodies, and dumped in the press and all that. That's not the way people behave. People care about people. They care about those bodies. They care about people on respirators. I mean, this is a heartbreaking situation for the world.
So there's a lot of negativity. I was watching, you know, I was watching CBS Sunday Morning. I watch it every Sunday pretty religiously at 9 a.m. And they were talking about two diseases, one that's COVID and the disease of negativity and fear. So you're saying that we're getting a lot of also negative messaging in what we're reading and what we're seeing. Why do you think it's positive thinking is so important right now in the midst of all this? Rob?
Yeah. Well, I think to answer that question, I have to kind of step back a little bit. I got a dose of preparation, I guess, maybe for this period of history. 3 years ago, my wife died. And so I had an opportunity, in retrospect, certainly, I can look at it that way, of trying to figure out how I can personally face suffering and adversity and come back to life, so to speak. So I was practicing up until this point, and I have a frame of reference. I think the risk is now that we can get so caught up in fear that we lose the present moment. And the present moment is always presenting an opportunity for something to be grateful for. And that's something I've been practicing, particularly since my wife died, by practicing meditation and studying Buddhism. And for me, it's really kind of been an orientation that has been a very positive gift for me. So if we can counter fear with an awareness of this very moment, with gratitude, and finding things to be grateful for, I think that to me is my doorway to finding hope and finding joy. I remember when I first started reading Thich Nhat Hanh's work, the Zen Buddhist Vietnamese teacher. He would talk about there's always something to be grateful for, and I remember feeling, back after my wife's death, or when she was dying prior to her death, felt absurd to me. It felt even an affront to my truth. Like the truth for me was, this is horrible. This is the end of of life as I know it. There was nothing good about this, and there was nothing good available to me. That's kind of how I approached it. And I think the risk is that a lot of us can approach this situation that way too now. There's so much horrible stuff going on the news, and also in our own, in our families, and worries and risks. Right now, my partner has a particular risk above her age. Although she's 11 years younger than me, and I'm just about to turn 70 shortly. But she's not as old as I am, but she has challenges with her lungs, so that the thought of being on a respirator or being unable to breathe is very real to her and very frightening. So since we're hunkering down together now for many weeks, my responsibility is to try and protect her. And when I have to go out, I have to be incredibly cautious about showering in the basement and putting my clothes in the wash and cleaning everything that I touched and cleaning every piece of food item or packaging on the food. And I can find myself getting very worked up with responsibility to save her, which can be overwhelming for me. What I can do, and I hope what I find that I'm able to do at times, and I'm very grateful that I can, is to remember that she's still here. She's still alive. I love her and she loves me, and I have a job to do, which is to try to protect her to the best of my ability. But I can't, as Gloria was saying, I can't control the outcome. I can just do my damnedest and do my best and be grateful that I have something that I can do to the best of my ability to take care of her during this time, which is a high risk time for both of us. My being an older guy, and her being particularly having some pre-existing challenges. So I think the thing that I cling to is, what can I find now in the here and the now? I want to share a poem that I use as a kind of mantra. That was written by Thich Nhat Hanh, and I kind of go to that if I wake up really worried at night, or if I find that I'm kind of getting panicky, or just start seeing the dark side of things. I say, I have arrived. I'm home, in the here, in the now. I'm solid. I am free. In the ultimate, I dwell. And it's a beautiful poem, and I find great comfort in it. I found that poem, I discovered it when I went to a Buddhist retreat shortly after my wife had died. And I was just amazed at how it calms me down. So whatever it is for you, whether it be a poem, whether it be a song, whether it be a visual memory or a sense memory you have of being at peace, that you can bring to the present moment and find that it kind of lowers that level of angst and anxiety and brings you to a place of peace. I like to remind myself, you know, the last part of that poem I just recited is, I am solid, I am free, in the ultimate I dwell. And sometimes I remember when I first started reciting this to myself, I'd say, in the internet I dwell. And I realized that, you know, it's funny, and it's sometimes I would find myself saying it unconsciously, but I think we can get very caught up in the internet and in news sources that are constantly available to us, and Facebook. And I mean, they're great in a lot of ways. They connect us with people we care about, but also we can lose a connection to what's right here, home, in my space, in my room, that I can kind of breathe with in a way that I can't breathe with, you know, as well, at least with images or things that I read about on the internet. So it's being present that I really find energy and joy from. It kind of comes out of that.
So very much one day at a time, 1 minute at a time, 1 breath at a time. I know they often talk about that in recovery. It's not even 1 day at a time, it's 1 second at a time.
Yeah, this is it. This is it. It helps me now.
And very much a reminder that we only have right now.
Yeah.
And I think that has really brought this to the forefront for people. But I also heard you talk a lot about thoughts. You know, thoughts can really dominate us. And, you know, part of the cognitive model is when we go into panic is when we kind of overestimate our fear. The thoughts of our fear can be overestimated. Our ability to cope with it can really send us into, you know, kind of perseverating on those thoughts and all that self-talk that comes along with the thoughts. How do we respond effectively to negative self-talk? It could be easy right now. I even caught myself right before this talk upstairs talking to somebody and saying, you know, I'm really just sick of COVID-19. Like I want to go out to a store. I want to do something. I'm just sick of this. So I had to kind of reframe it for myself and step back. But how do you respond to effectively, I think, to that negative self-talk? Jacob, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think one very important thing to realize is that our brain is hardwired for connection. So we need bonds with other people. We need secure bases to override this primary brain reaction that is now being stirred, you know, this anxiety. When we are anxious, we need to have contact with secure bases that can calm our brain down. Not talk our brain down, but calm our brain down. And so one of the things that I was just leaving an interview before I joined you with the CEO of the hospital that is in the epicenter of the corona outbreak in the Netherlands. And he said, it took me 8 days to realize I was, as the CEO, in a survival mode. I was acting, I was doing things, I was silent. And then my team members told me I seemed to be calm, but they didn't see any, from the outside, they didn't see any empathetic reaction. They didn't see any emotions. So they doubted whether I was really present for them. And he said, as soon as I opened my heart, so when I looked everyone in the eyes, he said I was literally walking around the room. I was looking them in the eyes, and I was feeling my tears when I was talking to them. All of a sudden, the dynamic in the room changed, and the other calmed down as well. And then they started to form a team that were doing things together, that were listening to each other, that were supporting each other. So you were asking the question, how do we have to deal with negative self-thought? Well, there is this paradox. In order to control or manage, I would rather say manage our negative self-thought, we need to probably practice reaching out to other people and saying, hey, I'm here. And I recall myself, we had the second press conference of our Prime Minister, I think now 4 weeks ago, in which he said, you will be locked down till the 1st of June. I was hearing him say the words. We probably all knew it was coming, but when he said it, I was overwhelmed with emotions. I was sitting on the couch, my wife was sitting next to me, and I at first didn't dare to share my tears. I felt a little bit shamed, like, goodness, I'm not going to cry because he's saying I have to stay inside. But I realized when I was looking at my wife, I looked her in the eyes and I allowed myself to cry. And then she held my hand. We didn't say anything to each other. And then we sat there for 5 minutes and I could calm down. I reconnected with my breathing. And then I stood up and then I felt that the positive feelings were coming again. So a big learning for me, again, was to breathe, to not tell myself everything will be okay, but to look for other eyes and allow myself to accept the reality. You cannot change what you don't accept. Mm. So it starts with learning to accept. And that's probably what resilience is for me as well. It's both the outcome and the process of a practice. And it's the process of the little steps of reaching out, saying, hey, here I am, I need your help, I need a body, I need a hand. And of course, many people are strongly struggling, as was I. I had heard of Zoom 4 weeks ago, but I'd never used it. It's the first time I was using Zoom. And I was narrow-minded, I think I was. Like, you cannot work on Zoom, you cannot connect on Zoom, this is not the way I want to work. Well, that's not true. You can really connect through Zoom. You can look people in the eye. People can express emotions through the camera. You can ask them questions, they can respond, you can be together. So probably for me, it's also about learning. The practice of what Robert just referred to, the practice of gratitude. Say, what am I grateful for today? What is a connection that I made? And what is something that I learned? So that is vitally important as well. Our brain calms down as soon as it's learning new things. Mm-hmm. So it's good for ourselves to say, hey, this is what I'm learning. It doesn't have to be tremendously successful reaching the New York Times. But I learned something new today, very small, and I'm going to celebrate what I learned.
So interesting. I was at a workshop that Dr. Bob Bauer gave a couple of years ago at ADEC, and I love this phrase, and I use it often, that we learn the world all over again after a loss. Mm. And so it's a learning process. So we have had a tremendous loss, the loss of the world as we know it right now. And learning ourselves and learning others is so very important. You learn that you could gain sort of a new skill and be okay with it. I know for myself, a lot of my clients that I see who had never been on teletherapy before were very anxious originally at first. And now that we're kind of 4 or 5 weeks into it, they're okay with it. Because like anything, when we don't know something new, we typically get really anxious. But the other thing I kind of heard you said was that it's important not to lie to ourselves. That's not the power of positive thinking. That is very destructive for people. So validating what you're going through, allowing those emotions to move through you, to feel them, but maybe also not staying in that place either. I had a client who shared with me this week that she kept saying that to herself, one of the mantras in her head was, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. So I asked her how she knew that. How did she know it was going to be okay? She said, I don't. I said, but you know that you're going to try your best, right? And she said, yeah, that sounds more realistic to me. So we kind of came up with that. And that really has, in the last couple of weeks, calmed her very much. So that not lying to ourselves, giving ourselves permission to really feel the emotions with this. I think, Peggy, you had something you wanted to say?
Well, I was just thinking as we were talking that what I've tried to challenge myself to do is to ask the question, how do I fill myself up in the midst of all of this? One thing that I have found, we were talking about the influence of the news, I have to pull back. I have to pull out of the news. I want to stay informed, and yet I have to fill myself up with inspiration. And if you look in between some of the horror on the news, they're giving these wonderful stories, you know, about someone reaching out to someone else, someone singing at a certain time, and everybody joining in and thanking other people. And so a part of what I try to do is to ask myself, almost vibrationally, what do I need to fill myself up with that keeps me whole and sane and balanced? And so that might be, for me, it might be nature. I've been noticing all kinds of things that are just right around my own yard that I didn't even know were there. It might be reaching out to other folks. And so I think, oh, I have a friend who lost her husband 6 years ago. I wonder what she's doing. Let me just check on what she's doing. It might be looking for inspiration myself. And so as a practice all last week, out of my own Christian tradition, I pulled up things from around the world in relationship to Holy Week, just every day. This and that and the other person, just all over the world, who had positive, inspirational, grounding sort of things for me to listen to for the sake of filling myself up. And then something that has not been brought up yet also has to do with humor. I find that that my trusted people that I'm making contact with on a regular basis now, that we've begun to share sillier things, funny things. People are sending all kinds of bizarre pictures of things they're working in the yard, and they're doing just anything to bring levity to the situation, to hold each other up with joy. And tomorrow night we've been having Zoom calls with my inner circle weekly, and tomorrow night we're gonna celebrate somebody's birthday. It's a very important time to say, hey, we're all in 10 different places and we're going to come together and celebrate. So I think focusing on what it is that I'm going to be grateful for, who am I reaching out to, what am I filling myself up with from the external world besides the horror of what we're seeing.
Heidi, you're a very humorous person. Have you tried to use any humor through what you're coping with right now? I know that can be a really fine line when someone's actually in the thick of things.
Well, I love what Peggy's saying, because what we focus on grows. And, you know, this pandemic has brought out the best in people. I mean, you've got all these COVID-19 memes that are very humorous. You have at 7 p.m. people screaming and yelling and clapping for our, you know, workers that are on the front lines. You have people with music, playing music on balconies. You have, you know, just people rising to the occasion. We are a resilient, incredible people, and coming together saying, you don't have to do this alone. This is a world problem. We're all in this together. We're going to get through this together. We might not know how, but we don't have to do it alone. And so I love everything that you've been saying about look for the helpers, as Mr. Rogers would say, because they're everywhere, and focus on those.
Sometimes you just have to look. As Lois Lane talked about in Justice League, look to the sky. Sometimes you can find your heroes just by looking. And so just by looking for some of the gains in life, because oftentimes the negativity can pull us so strongly in that direction that we don't see things that can be positive gains or meaningful things that are happening in the midst of such pain. So with that said, oh, Jacob, you had your hand up.
Yeah, there's something I would like to share. Last week, I had a very long conversation with Dr. Edith Eva Eger. You may know her, who's living in San Diego. The Holocaust survivor wrote The Choice, Embracing the Possible. A dear friend of mine who was in the Netherlands last year. And she would refer to Auschwitz, which she survived, as being the greatest gift in her life. For the reason that she would say, in Auschwitz, I learned everything that I need to know about myself and how to be resilient. And one of the, for me, most touching examples, apart from what you said last week again, is in Auschwitz, we formed a family of inmates. And it was this forming of a family that made us survive and made us look on the positive things that were happening both within that family, but also that we had a goal that lied beyond the gates of Auschwitz. And there's one example of positivity that strikes me most in her book. So I would really, if you haven't read it, it's so very inspiring when it comes to positive thinking. So she's there with her sister. Both her parents have been murdered. And then they go to a shower and they have to be shaved. So, and her sister was having long hair and she's now bald. And her sister Magda looks Edie in the eyes and says, "How do I look?" And then instantly, as she describes in the book, she knew she had a choice. She could say something about her being bald, about her having lost her hair, about how scary it is to be there together. And then she takes a decision to say to Magda, "You've got very beautiful eyes." And that moment is for her a big lesson on how you can, even in the worst of circumstances, deliberately practice, focus on what you want to see. And that is not like, it's not a platitude. It's not like cheaply denying that there are things going around you that are negative, but it's really practicing your brain to focus on what you're seeing, because that is helpful for you to feel better.
Just like Viktor Frankl said, the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one attitude in a given set of circumstances. So resilience and positivity, anyone could be resilient when given the best circumstances, right? But it's really those that are most adverse and those that are most suffering in which we really need to be able to pull on those abilities to be positive or recognize the beauty, even in sometimes the most dark of days. Gloria, I think you had your hand up.
Well, one of the things that comes up for me is that we're focused on the COVID and we're acting like, I mean, not acting, but we're talking like, you know, that's kind of the major focus, and it is on the show because I call my shows COVID at the beginning and all that. But Rob brought up something that his wife died 3 years ago. He is still grieving that loss and in this relationship. And what a challenge it is right now for us to be with our clients where they are and not forget where they are, not forget that it was my son's death day on April 2nd and being in isolation. You know, what do you do to celebrate a life, you know, his life, because it's been a long time. But people who are having losses, 2 weeks ago, a little boy was killed, hit by a car in our neighborhood. You know, how is that family dealing with it? How are we as therapists able to hold our self where we are in this space and then remember those other spaces and, you know, be connected? And I think that's one reason we've gone to 330,000 people downloading our podcasts in April from 70,000 in March, because we are touching and remembering when we have folks on those losses that are there. We're still supporting them in where they happen to be right now. So it's a challenge right now because we're dealing with past and current with ourselves and with our clients and everyone. It's a huge challenge to find that positivity in there and to make sure we touch those spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember being at Open Hope several years ago when you showed a virtual funeral. And I think you did a podcast on that. So this is something that you've been trying to help people with for a long time, the virtual space of connectedness. But yeah, the newly bereaved right now have so much additional stress on them. I know I'm dealing with that with my clients. I think, Peggy, you had your hand up.
Well, I was just having the thought of, I think we're in a time of both and, you know, the reality of what we're in and something else that we're grateful for, or something else that might be going on. So the group of people getting together tomorrow night that I was referring to in my life, yes, we're having a birthday celebration, but we're also one among us is grieving and has a death date on Friday within her own scope. And so what we're going to try to do is to have sort of a both and, you know, how do you, and that's difficult. How do you hold the distress and the reality and have reverence almost for that, and celebrate and express gratitude. And I think that's very difficult sometimes as human beings to hold those things. We want them to be one way or the other. Let's do the birthday thing, or let's do the death date thing, and then get quickly back to the birthday, you know, kind of thing. And in actuality, I think part of what we're called upon to do is to hold both. It's the paradox. And I'm not great at it. People in general aren't great at it, you know, but I try to remind myself there's both. You know, the story's not over yet. There's both. There's this and there's this. And that we sort of have a promise that of being able to live in that paradox. And then our supportive people help pull us back to that when we forget that, I think. You know, our memories can be very short when we're distressed, and we need reminders. We need people, trusted folks who can then say, well, and there's this, and there's this. And we have to hold both.
Jacob, you had your hand up?
Well, I want to say here. It's also about the power of rituals. Mm-hmm. So if we use rituals, be them old rituals or new ones that we invent on the spot, we know from research that performing rituals and doing them over and over again while we are emotionally bonded also with the ones around us, again, calms us down, gives us a sense of control, even though that control is maybe illusory. But it gives us the idea that we can set direction again. And also for leaders in this situation, when they are leading their teams, it's so very important that they start the shift, that they start the day with really bring people together, having to check in, share what inviting them to share what they are feeling, not forcing them, but gently inviting them, but also close the day and close the shift, also in hospitals to what was you learning today? What are you grateful for? What was painful for today? So the power of rituals cannot be underestimated.
Mm-hmm.
And you have your hand up, Rob?
Yeah, I just think that's so true and resonates with me so much. One of the issues that so many people are dealing with now is that they're losing the rituals they would normally have, you know. And I'm working with a man now whose son died on Easter Sunday, COVID-related death, and he, you know, of course, struggles with the fact that they haven't not been able to have a funeral. They don't know when the funeral will be. They were planning. Normally he would. The ritual he was familiar with and comfortable with relatively was a burial. They made a decision instead to cremate, so they could have their son with them while they wait for the event of the ritual that they would anticipate at some later date. One of the things that he said, which struck me, was so hopeful for me, was that he said, you know, the funeral is not canceled, it's delayed. And they went ahead as a family, remotely, because a lot of people can't be together in the family, of course, but they plan the funeral, you know, and they know exactly where it'll be. They have a vision of what the funeral will be, and that has given them a great deal of comfort. Another thing that comes to mind, I think that Jill, maybe something you said, Jill, this stirred this memory in me of working with a young woman, and actually she's in the same family. It's her brother that died. And, you know, I entered into the conversation with her in my initial meeting, learning about her relationship to her brother and learning about her grief and the struggles she's facing in the context of confinement. And in the course of my initial assessment, of course, you know, I learned that she wasn't just grieving that death. You know, she was grieving also a few weeks earlier, a friend had taken her life. So you know, we also can think COVID, but also I think maybe it was Gloria who said we have to look at the bigger picture. What else is going on in our lives? Yeah, and for me, it's true. I'm facing the third year anniversary in a couple of weeks of my wife's death. And at the same time, I'm celebrating a new relationship, you know, that is also very much part of my life and a wonderful thing. And at the same time, I'm worried about my son, who's an ER nurse, going into the fray every day. And I worry about his safety. And I worry about my grandkids. And I worry about what kind of life, what's it like to grow up as a 3-year-old. I have 2 3-year-old grandkids, to grow up in that world, in this world. How are they going to manage this new world? So we have layers and layers of challenges. And what I found hopeful in that conversation I had with that young woman whose brother died and also whose friend took her life, was her sense of humor that was just so rich and so valuable for her experience, and just gave me great appreciation for her and hope that that will really be a through line in her process. It already has been. And that's what I look for, and I find, and it generates hope for me when I see people who pull upon their strengths and they carry on. And I think that one thing about this COVID experience is that we're all in this together. Mm-hmm. We all have our story of fear in our own way. We all have other losses that integrate into this experience. We have lessons that we've learned and lessons we're learning every day. It's very much of a communal experience, yet very often in isolation at the same time. And that's fascinating to me. And yes, it's an opportunity as well. If we're going to be alone, it's an opportunity to understand ourselves better and learn how to take care of ourselves and learn how to be compassionate towards ourselves. So it's really unfolding to me, and I think to all of us, as finding opportunities in this circumstance. And those of us who are privileged to work with folks who are dealing with challenges related to grief now are giving us help. Also, often I find giving me hope that we can face incredible adversity. And yeah, the Holocaust stories are great opportunities for us to remember that there is empowerment even in the worst circumstances we can imagine.
Probably a lot of commonalities. I have a daughter that goes to work for Amazon Whole Foods every day in Arlington here in Virginia. And the worries can stack up. A lot of things maybe we can connect with and talk about. But you can have those massive layers of worry. So how do you not allow that to overwhelm you? How do you think people can not allow that to overwhelm them? What are some of the best practices in focusing on the positive? Gloria, you had your hand.
Well, I like to call it self-soothing. Self-soothing activities. What stuff? Rob's hugging himself. Hugging yourself. Heidi and I talk about some of these self-soothing activities. Hugging yourself. Waking up in the morning and keeping a gratitude list. You know, waking up and saying, I'm happy I can open my eyes this morning. I'm happy that there's sun out. I'm happy I can, you know, put my feet on the floor. So finding those gratitude kinds of things. But I think for people who are quite evolved, and I think probably most ADAC members are very evolved. I believe that. And I think that they see themselves as strength-based. I think how you see yourself. I'm a strength-based person. And you were talking about the Holocaust. That's not my history. I have a different history. That's what my relatives crossed the plains. And I have many crossing the plains story, much death. So I'm thinking maybe a good time to go to Ancestry.com and look at the history of your families. You know, because life has been filled with adversity for everyone. And, you know, if you look back far enough, you'll find it. And we're strength-based people. We're amazing people. I think part of it is just thinking that I am a strength-based person.
Jacob?
I think it's not the most sexiest of topics to address, but I think it's important. is to have people ask you to be daring you to abstain from addictive behaviors. So what I see in my practice, a lot of men, heaps of men, are now, and the statistics, if you, they were published a few weeks ago here in the Netherlands, the people that are watching now, for instance, pornography, and I'm not touching upon the morality of it all. I'm not so much interested in that, but the addictive behavior of watching the pornography, drinking, that really is so very unhealthy. And sometimes people do it because they don't know what to do differently or what to do else. But I think it's very wise to allow one or two close friends in your circle. If it's your own partner, that's also a very good opportunity to be a, how do you say that in English? To watch over you a little bit and to help you not do those things. Because this morning I heard someone say he never drank in his whole life, and he just started drinking 3 weeks ago. And he said, no, I just, just before I go to sleep, I take 1 or 2 glasses. And I don't know if it was 1 or 2 glasses, but I said, well, why are you doing this? He said, yeah, because I can't fall asleep, because I'm anxious, and I'm afraid that I won't fall asleep and I will be lying awake all night. So there's definitely one thing you should not do, and it's don't drink.
Something that's confusing can turn into a maladaptive and an addiction, but it also speaks to the nature not just of people falling back on that, but I have to say that there's a lot of people engaging in that stuff because they're really bored. You have to think of things to do, and the power of being meaningful and purposeful every day. Not everybody now either has a job or they have the ability, even those of us that do have a job and are maintaining that job, some of the things that replenish us. Like I gave an example, every Wednesday night for myself and my partner, every Wednesday night was my reset night. We would meet, it was middle of the week, we'd go out for dinner. It was the reset night, and it replenished me for the rest of the week. And it is really different trying to do that at home. I don't get that same replenishment. So I'm an extrovert. I like the social interaction. I like the company. And a lot of people are feeling like they have to think of things to do. They have to make up things to do at home. And some of it, unfortunately, is really bad stuff. Jacob, you had your hand up again?
Yeah, I'm working a lot and writing a lot now on the topic of calling. And what I see with most of my clients, I think 80 to 90% is precisely what you're saying, Jill, is they are now at home. And, if they've been working too hard or not purposefully neglecting their partner too much, we're all human. So it happens every now and then. If we work too hard or we focus too much on the wrong things. But they are now indeed at home asking themselves, who am I? Who am I? It's the biggest and the first questions of your calling. Who am I, and what do I want to do in the world? So most people are very much aware of what they want to do in the world, but they're less aware of who they are. And when they're sitting at home on the couch and they think they're only meaningful if they come immediately into action, or then it doesn't help them. So this is really an invitation to profoundly think of who you are. And like here in the Netherlands, when children are not going to school, there are a lot of mothers and a lot of fathers really seeing and having their eyes open that they were not so much involved in the upbringing of their children, or how they were doing their homework, or what they were learning. So it's a great opportunity to also assess yourself. Who am I as a father? Who am I as a mother? Who am I as a partner?
Interesting. Because also, though, self-introspection, too much of it can also not be very good for people, to shine a light on too much stuff that maybe you were trying to distract yourself. There's balance in it. There's balance in it. Peggy, you're shaking your head.
Well, I was just thinking about how for most of us as human beings, I think this idea of fluidity, as opposed to being rigid, to be fluid, so that we have it's back to the both and thing again. I've been looking at a concept called, about grief specifically being sort of home and pilgrimage, home and journey, and how one informs the other. And so part of what we're talking about, I think, is this fluidity between action and contemplation. What am I going to do? Who am I? You know, kind of how do we fluidly go back and forth with that? And how do we know when to pull ourselves out, like you were saying, Jill, so that if we get overly focused on who am I, that it may be time to take a walk. It may be time to reach out. It may be time to actually take action of a different sort, to play music, to vacuum the house, to whatever it is, whatever the action orientation is going to be, just for the sake of movement and momentum, because we all know that with our clients and with ourselves that's important, that you stay in action. And then there's this invitation, as Jacob was talking about, for contemplative sort of musing, really, you know, in terms of who am I, what do I want to offer, what am I grateful for, what are the unexpected mercies that have come to me or that I want to give to someone else, you know, those kinds of contemplative activities, and then being able to fluidly pull out and go over here and act in a different way. So just that, the motion that comes to mind is this, as opposed to, I think sometimes when we think of resilience, we think of people hunkering down, like I'm going to be strong and sturdy and the way I was, or I'm going to be so strength-based that there's not a opening for something new, like what is it that I might do that's different, as opposed to drink, or as opposed to whatever it is that I do to stay in control. I've had to watch myself, like I'm pretty much an organized, sort of structured person, and this thing has thrown me for a loop because my husband's home. Well, that just messes up my whole deal. We're all familiar with that. So you got another person interjected into the way I want my day to go. He wants to watch the news. I'm trying to pull out of the news. He wants it to be noisy. I want it to be quiet. And we love each other and we're trying to coexist. You know, so how do we like maneuver all of that? You know, just thoughts that I was having about the conversation.
I don't know when I signed up to have a family, if I signed up to be around them 24, love them to death. And I have a wonderful son who's 19 who has autism. Heidi and Gloria have met him. He's a hoot, but he thinks I'm working from home. He doesn't really understand the concept of working from home. He thinks I'm hanging out at home so he can access me all the time. And I love him to death, but I got to take some mental health breaks once in a while and just kind of move away from people in my family to make sure that we give each other space with each other. But I think, Jacob, I want to get back to a point that you brought up. It's really important. And when we're talking about this, you know, addictive behaviors or, you know, things that could lead to addiction, you know, this idea of maybe not shaming people right now, because that can be very difficult during these times. And I'll give an example of, I have a client whose son died 6 months ago by suicide, and he's a pretty well-organized man, pretty adaptive. He is having some major anxiety being at home, and he's going through his list of things to do every day, and at the end of the day, he's, you know, wrapping it up with a couple of beers a night before he goes to bed. So I think as clinicians, I'm not certainly saying that's okay, but I'm not saying it's not okay either. I think these are exceptional times. So this whole idea of shame, and I thought maybe you could address that with us a little bit around that, since you brought it up.
That's a beautiful question. So I would even sometimes say to clients, take a bottle and enjoy it. But take a bottle and don't enjoy it fully on your own. So there's nothing wrong with if for a period of time you take a few beers because you feel that that's the beautiful ending of your day. It becomes problematic if it is done without a context of people that for some reason, people are sources of inspiration, other sources of inspiration that you can connect with. So if you do it in complete solitude, then it becomes problematic. But if there's someone who is in contact with you, who can ask you questions, who can put an arm around you or make eye contact or whatever ways of bonding there are, then it becomes less problematic. But I would like to uphold if it's really drinking for a long period of time, for instance, drinking, and without the social connection, it is simply dangerous.
Mm. Yeah, good point. But bringing up this whole idea, because Gloria brought up self-soothing activities, and what we might think are self-soothing activities might not be what other people think are self-soothing activities. So, Rob, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just thinking, reflecting on what you said, and Jacob, and one of the challenges, of course, that a lot of people are facing is that they're alone. They don't have it. They don't have anyone to drink with, or anyone to have sex with, or anyone to do all the various things that we might want to do that would be more socially acceptable to do with other people. So it poses a real challenge. I'm sure you know this, but I just thinking about how I don't have the answer to that, but I'm saying that it seems like people who are singular during this period of time are faced with isolation, loneliness, and difficulty appreciating what they can do for themselves. So it comes back to, I think, what you were saying, Gloria, like really learning self-soothing practices and being encouraged, normalizing them. I was fascinated that I think it was the New York City Department of Public Health put out a statement encouraging people who were alone to masturbate.
Wow.
I mean, that was extraordinary.
I didn't see that.
And they were talking about possibility. They was looking at a whole range of possibilities, including sexting with a partner who you're separated from. They were like spelling out a whole bunch of things that would seemed unusual to me. But when I read it, I was feeling, wow, it's really, under the circumstances, very enlightening and useful information for people who may have a lot of judgments about what they do with their bodies or how they relate to other people in various ways. So they weren't saying, drink alone. Yeah, they would not say that. I don't think they would do that. And I think that there are risks in all sorts of activities. And there's risks in using pornography, but pornography might be something that would be helpful for someone who is alone. So, it's hard to label, for me, it's hard to label an activity without understanding the context and how people do what they're doing, under what kind of ethical or personal value system and circumstances in which they're living.
Well, I think, Rob, you bring up a perfect point, is that it's hard to understand it under this context.
Mm.
So there's a meme going around, one of our friends shared with us. It's a man sitting on a couch, drinking a beer, watching TV, and it says, and over his head, there's a date that says 2019, and it says, bum. And then it's the same picture, and it says 2020, and it says socially responsible adult. Sitting on the couch, drinking a beer, watching TV. So, we're talking about the context of situations right now, and these are really muddy waters for everybody. So kind of getting back to, and kind of with the limited time we have left here today, talking about positive reframing, but also this whole idea that, Jacob, I like that you brought it up, the idea that with self-soothing activities, this role of possibly us really having to heavily look at this idea of shame or, labeling behaviors right now for people that are trying very hard during these I think this is going to bring out a lot of stress. We know that the domestic violence rates are up. We're seeing in some countries the suicide rate is up. A lot of babies may be born from this. Mm-hmm. And there are some people, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Rob, that I have a client who's been separated from her partner. He's on the West Coast, she's on the East Coast. He was out there. They can't see each other. So loss of a sex life for people, which brings enjoyment and connection for folks. So with that said, I know we're kind of ending a little bit today, but I want to ask you all to define, just so our audience knows, and I don't want to make the assumption that they know, what is the difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth? Anybody want to answer that?
Well,
go ahead, Gloria.
I'll be happy to throw my thought in. Resilience is something that actually can be taught. And I believe that that's what a lot of what we do in therapy is teach people and work with them on how they can be more resilient, doing things like meditation, uh, writing, journaling. We teach them all sorts of things to build on their resilience. Some people are more resilient than others. We think maybe there's some biological, but also like with when they're babies, some babies are allowed to self-soothe. It starts really early, and some are in traumatic situations with their families and they're never able to learn those self-soothing activities. So I think resilience can be taught. But on the other hand, we've got post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is something that we are all in. We're thrown in right now. We're all being thrown into trauma. How we come out of it, whether we grow in certain aspects, whether we become more religious, whether we become finding out who I am, what life's about. If there's any little areas, it doesn't have to be some big, wow, no, you know, look at how I've changed and who I am now. It can be small areas, but hopefully coming out of this crisis, I don't think it's going to happen for everybody. There'll be some people who will not recover from this. But there will be some who will grow, and hopefully it'll be the majority, hopefully will be kinder, you know, all those kind of things. So that's my thought on it anyway.
So I know Tedeschi and Calhoun kind of define post-traumatic growth as the changes that occur moving through trauma. The changes can be a change in a sense of hopefulness. You may be able to find a newfound strength in yourself of getting through adversity. You may have spiritual growth. For some people, this, as Rob shared with us before, his change and his in growth with Buddhism. There may be a spiritual growth within you. There may be growth within relationships. I came out of the oncology world. So I was an oncology social worker for many years. And I guess a lot of what I've learned through my patients, and I always say I learned the most through my patients, was the way they face sometimes going through cancer and dying from it. And I watched some people who just absolutely taught me everything about resilience and post-traumatic growth through that adversity, not sweating things like the small stuff, you know, looking at the bigger picture and things. So that's sort of the changes. The post-traumatic growth is the changes. Resilience, I think, is what you're talking about in terms of like character or ability to teach people how to grow through things. And Peggy, I know there's been a lot of research on this. What does kind of the literature tell us, the science about resilience?
Well, there is a science associated with resilience. There's also an art, I think, but there's a science, and we know that, as Gloria was saying, that we have capabilities that can be strengthened at any age. That's a part of what we know from developmentalists and other researchers. So we can learn stress reduction, we can learn self-regulation, we can learn coping capacities, adaptive skills, self-efficacy. Those things can be taught and they can be learned, and the literature is pretty clear on that as a part of the science. Another interesting part of the science of resilience is the use of either faith and or cultural traditions that sort of as a foundation for hope and for stability. And so if we talk about resilience, I think we're talking about behaviors and traits and abilities and processes that can be strengthened and built and all of that. And then it comes to my mind that we haven't really highlighted the idea of choice and the idea that we can choose to interpret and live into an experience is the whole concept, as we know, of reconstruction of ourselves and of meaning and of life after loss and that kind of thing, that we have this choice that we can make. And post-traumatic growth to me is about that. It's how can I focus my sight to something that is beyond the distress that I feel. You know, how can I use then resilience sort of as a formation of, I'm going to use those traits and abilities to make this choice, to perceive this and to act into this kind of cognitive choice that I'm making. And when we do that, just like you said at the very beginning, Jill, then a whole magical thing happens, as we know, to ourselves. We think and then we feel different things. And then, you know, from a holistic standpoint, then it shifts who we are and what we will do coming out of distress. And we all fortunately have seen that in many of the clients that we work with. I remember I've been thinking about the first client that I ever saw, which was 30 years ago as a grief counselor. The first client I ever saw, and it was Mary. She was she's fine with me sharing this story. She's let me do this multiple times over the years, but on a random day, it happened to be raining, and she said to her 17-year-old, "Sure, go pick up a pizza. Take your brother with you." Well, we can imagine that on a rainy night with a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old in the car got out of control, and all of a sudden she lost her identity. She was a stay-at-home mom. She lost who she was, her grounding, her calling with what she was bringing. And I watched her muster. Was in counseling with her for a year, and I watched her just muster this thing that we call resilience. And it wasn't an easy thing. She went in and out of it, and we had to I had to remind her about the strengths that she had and remind her of a landscape that she didn't yet know that might be possible, while also standing with her in the reality of what she was experiencing at the time, which also included, unfortunately, that she and her husband lost each other in the middle of all this, and a divorce ensued, and so really she lost the foundation, with her life, really, with her life. But how marvelous it was to stand beside her and really just in wonder watch and participate when I could, and when there was an opening or a need. Participate with her in restructuring just a whole different person and redesigning a whole different life, and how honored and privileged we are to have the opportunity really to stand with someone who can do that. And to me, it's like, there it is. Then there is what we talk about in terms of that fluidity of there's life and there's death. The whole story is not written yet. We don't know where we're going to be with this pandemic. We don't know what we might find in ourselves that's different from who we've been, or where we've been, or what we've been, or how we've done it before.
And as counselors and therapists, I think it's so important. Part of our job sometimes is to highlight, because sometimes you can't see your own stuff when you're in it. Mm-hmm. And I had a client this week who is in her 60s. She just lost her adult daughter at 40 pretty suddenly a couple of months ago. And, she's having to get through her days of business meetings. And she was just crying and had a whole bunch of negative self-appraisal, like, I'm not doing a good job. I'm not keeping up. Everybody else seems to be doing better than I am. All her coworkers. So part of my job was to just let her know that how strong she was, in the sense that she was carrying this boulder of grief on her back. Well, most of her other coworkers, you don't know what's going on in somebody's life, but she is really strong just by getting up and brushing her teeth every day, just by putting on her clothes and going to work and showing up and participating. Sometimes that's the most strength you can have when you're so heavily grieving the loss of somebody. So it's important for us sometimes to remind people about how really strong they are, because when you're in so much pain and you're in so much distress and you feel so much loss, we don't often see it. Heidi, I think you're here.
That's what's going to be my point, Jill, because COVID-19 and what's going on with this pandemic is very reminiscent of the way people felt during and after 9/11. And I worked with the FDNY, as you know, Jill, because your father was an FDNY. I worked with the FDNY for 10 years after 9/11. And last night, one of the kids, it's not a kid anymore, who I worked with for 10 years, called me. Her father died in the World Trade Center. And she said, Heidi, this pandemic is bringing up so many feelings of grief and loss for me. The feeling in the world feels similar. I don't know what I'm going to do. And she's just cried. And I said to her, let's go back and review how resilient you were and how you got through not only the death of your father, not only how you survived the death of your father, who was the light of her life, but how you ended up thriving. Let's go back, because like you said, sometimes it's hard for people to realize how resilient they are. We have to go back and help them and say, this is what worked for you then. Let's see if some of these coping skills can work for you now.
So important. I mean, you were working with the FDNY. I was there, Project Liberty, through my agency, South Shore Child Guidance Center in Freeport, New York. And I think our 9/11 survivors are probably very triggered by what's going on now, but also very much can show us, you know, how we can manage through such profound loss and adversity. Rob,
Absolutely. I think that this pandemic, I'm sorry, is showing, you know, we've been down these roads as a country, as a world, and we've been through great adversity. And we have not only survived, but thrived, but we've done it together. And at Open to Hope, we always end our shows by saying, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own.
So Rob, I think you had your hand up.
No, I didn't, but maybe it was there. I didn't know it.
You're blocking out the sunlight as we're
Yeah, but I do have something to say, and really in line with what's being said by Heidi and Jill and probably everybody. I find that what keeps me going in my work, even when we as people who work with grief are touching suffering constantly. We're hearing difficult stories. We're seeing people going through the worst times. It's also seeing their resilience when and there might be a little hint of something, like the humor I saw in the client I worked with earlier today, and in the midst of all the difficulties she was experiencing, she could laugh. And I if we look hard enough, we see their hidden strengths, and that gives me such hope. So I from that frame of reference, it keeps me going, and it carries me through my own challenges, and also through the work that I'm doing and that we're all doing. Where there is hope there is strength there, and the strength generates mutual hope. I think that we're very much when I'm working with people, I feel we're in this thing together. We're not that separate as we might sometimes forget to be the truth. We're there. We're human beings with an opportunity to be together for a time, and we help each other. One thing I want to say is that when I was moving through my own grief after my wife's death, what carried me, the way I think about what you just said, Heidi, how your client called you, re-stimulated around the traumas of today and the 9/11 trauma for her. What carried me a lot through my grief were my clients in the past who showed me how to grieve well. And I kept remembering particular people who I've met over the years who taught me different lessons in the work that I've been doing throughout my career. And that really seemed to carry me. So they brought me so much faith in myself and hope that I could get through this in some way, even though I didn't always know how. So there's a mutuality here in terms of what we learn and how we learn from each other.
Jacob?
Yeah, to build on that from a neural perspective, from a brain perspective as well, resilience is formed in and grows through connection. It's an attachment. It grows in attachment. So we need to be able to attach to other people, to places, to goals in order to grow in our resilience. And that's where we as counselors, coaches, therapists come in and play a big role, because we become often temporary secure bases for other people to relearn the resilience that they really have, and to dare them to have access to it. And I really liked what was said earlier. It's really so it's being able to connect to other secure bases, but also to become a secure base to yourself. And you do that through having other people recall practices that you did with earlier traumatic events and life events that you can recall and say, hey, yes, indeed, this worked for me. I might want to practice it now. So yeah, we need each other. We're in this together and we have to reach out.
Peggy?
It occurs to me that we've been talking about this, but we haven't really said it. And so I just wanted to say it, that I think that we have an opportunity to share vulnerability in a way that often we mask. And we have all kinds of ways that we do that through our degrees and through our accolades and through our, and what we really we're just talking about is how we can be transformed by our clients. They're not just transformed by a therapeutic process, that we're also, and that's about vulnerability. There's a beautiful book that many of you probably know called Broken Open, yeah, by Elizabeth Lesser. And she talks about, she collected a lot of stories from clients and other folks who talked about what happened to them when they lived into feeling broken, into their vulnerability, into what did they find on the other side of that. It's a really marvelous read that sort of reminds us, I think, of our shared vulnerability. I don't know, Jill, whether we have a moment. I have a poem that I really would like to share if we have time.
We have a couple of minutes left.
Okay. This is from a person that I don't know, Lynn Unger, and I apologize, Lynn, if I'm not, if you hear this and I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. She was in Australia, and right before we got the stay-at-home order, I went to a retreat offered by the Center for Renewal and Courage, Parker Palmer's origination, and it was on cultivating a meaningful life. And the pandemic hit. It was just emerging, and the pandemic was beginning to hit. And this is the last day. This is what they shared, and I'll see if I can do it with my own vulnerability. So what if we thought of the pandemic as the Jews considered the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling, give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life, center down, and when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You can hardly deny that now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has become clear. Do not reach out with your hands, reach out with your heart. Reach out with your words, reach out with all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. I just thought it was really beautiful.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Peggy. And thank you for bringing up this issue of shared vulnerability. In my sessions, quite often I have a few clients who ask me how I'm doing. That's how they lead off the session. And normally that's a challenge sometimes to certain therapists. So it, really depends on which approach you come to, who you're working with. But, that has been a challenge to share my own vulnerability with my clients who are asking me how I'm doing through this crisis. So I think that's an important point that you raise about our vulnerability now. So in closing, I wanted to ask, we take on, as Peggy said, we're holding a lot of different feelings. We are this sort of safe holding space for people, that holding environment. And we're taking on a lot of people's stresses right now, a lot of people's uncertainty and their angst, while we're going through this ourselves. It's a shared experience. So how are you all coping with that? What kind of things would you like to share with the members of ADEC who are also therapists, counselors, or care providers about that? I know sometimes at night I go to bed and I really have to turn off a lot of worries that I hear from my clients in my head to not let them become my worries. Rob, you're shaking your head.
Oh, well, I shared my Buddhist orientation that seems to carry me pretty well during stressful times, but in a very concrete way. When I wake up, I say a little prayer of gratitude, and I say thank you for this new day now beginning. Thank you for the passage through the night. Thank you for the gifts and blessings, challenges and teachings, miracles and mysteries of this most amazing life. Grant your blessings, my teachers and guides, that all that I say, think, and do this day, I may be an instrument of the precious Dharma, an instrument of healing, blessing, and liberation. Let my life be an expression of love and wisdom, peace and joy, truth and freedom, that I and all beings, without exception of any kind, may awaken together and live in harmony with the great way that is beyond all names and forms. May it be so. So that's how I start. And I look at my partner, and I'm grateful that we're together, and I begin my day.
You start your day on a positive footing, or a mindful, kind of grounded footing.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Jacob, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, next to eating too much chocolate, but I don't know if that's what you're. and it's Easter time, so we eat a lot of chocolate here in the Netherlands. No, I like to walk, and since we live in a beautiful space, so we are so fortunate as to be able to have a walk. And normally when I would be at home, I'm not often during the week, I'm not often at home, but now I am. And when we were at home, we would walk together for 4.5 kilometers, say 3 miles. And now I do that twice a day. And I do it every day. You know, I've probably not done it in 1 month for 3 days, but I just tell myself, like today, I was back to back in Zoom meetings. And it was 1 hour that was just prior to this one. And I said to myself, I haven't moved today. So I put on my jacket and I start walking. And I listen to the birds, I look at the lake, and that's what I'm doing. And I don't negotiate with myself. So however busy it is, how much stress I experience, I go out and walk. And 90% of the times with my wife, and that's beautiful as well.
Great. I know that right now, like, also self-compassion is really important, because you know, there's a lot of stuff going on the internet and Facebook about how many projects people are doing, how many things people are accomplishing, how much work they're doing, how much exercise they're getting. And, you know, the other day I didn't get on my Peloton, I ate a lot of pasta. And, you know, at the end of the day, I could have really beat myself. My father used to have the saying that you should beat yourself with a feather and not a stick. So I could have beat myself with a stick for not adhering to my, you know, low carbs and exercise diet with all this time I have on my hands. So I think that idea of being compassionate with ourselves so that we can also help others be compassionate with themselves is really important, not holding ourselves to such high standards too at this time. Gloria, I think you had something to say.
Oh, I did. Okay. What do I do? I have been married to my
husband. I might have voluntold you.
I've been married to my husband for 60 years, and we are very lucky to be sheltering together. And I'm sheltering with some of my grandchildren, and watching them, I'm curious. I'm very curious about how everybody's adapting. I find it very interesting to have a senior in high school, all his trials and tribulations, a granddaughter who's breaking up with her boyfriend because they've been sheltering together and it's not working out, a grandson who is hoping he won't get laid off. It's been fascinating for me to watch everybody, and I'm trying to be fairly quiet. I'm trying to, you know, I will put in a compassionate word, but I'm really trying not to do the whole therapy thing because they're having their experience right now, and so am I. So I'm looking at myself. I'm trying not to do my regular thing, which is fascinating to me, and a time for introspection in myself. So I'm finding that really interesting, and a sense of humor is always important for me. My husband's great, makes me laugh nonstop. We play a lot of Rummy too. What can I say?
Well, I like how you use the word sheltering, because language is so important the language we use really affects the thoughts we have. And Dr. Andy Ho, who was on our international panel the other day, told us that, in Singapore, they're using the word circuit breakers. It's a really more empowering word than feeling locked down. We're not on house arrest. We're sheltering. We're doing this for our own safety and the safety of others. So I really love how you use that word. We really have to be mindful of the words we use, because the words can be very powerful in our negative thoughts and our negative, our way of feeling negative about ourselves. So anybody else?
Yeah, I'd like, for me, I think and for people out there, finding safe people where you can express your fears, your anxiety, and your concerns around this pandemic. And I'm also thankful that I am symptom-free today of COVID-19, because there are so many people that aren't, and so many people that are in the hospital and are fighting for their lives, and trying not to feel guilty about when I have positive thoughts, because there's some guilt that sometimes is a barrier. And I guess the last thing I want to say is, you were talking about words being powerful. Governor Cuomo said something which I think is really important. He said, we need to physically distance, but stay spiritually connected.
So important. Well, I want to thank you all today for joining us on ADEC's COVID series, the power of positive thinking and addressing grief and resilience. Thank you very much, Rob, Gloria, Jacob, Heidi, and Peggy. And Heidi, I just want to do a special thanks to you for being here. I know it's been a difficult time for you, but we are so happy that you joined us here today, and to give us the positivity of the fact that you're still engaging in things and you're doing well is so important to us. We're just so happy to see you. So on behalf of ADEC, thank you all for joining us today in conversation.
For letting us on.
Yes, thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
It was great.
Good, Jill.
Yeah,
great.
not
Good to see you.
And
nice
thank
meeting you all.
you all too. And thank you for joining us at ADEC in Conversation. And for all of you, be well, be safe. Please practice good physical distancing guidelines. As someone said the other day, wash your hands. So everyone take care, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.